Good morning. My name is Clark Miller, and I'm a professor at the School for the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University. And this is another video in my series of videos on knowledge management and knowledge analysis. In this one, I want to grapple with the question, what are ways of knowing? So if you're a philosopher and you run across a statement like E equals mc squared, right? Einstein's famous equation for the relationship between energy and mass. What you care about is whether that statement is true or not. Because if it's not true, then it's false and it's nothing, right? But if it's true, then you can rely on it in a philosophical sense, meaning it can become the basis of other true statements about the world. And so it rises to the level of knowledge, right? But if you're a knowledge analyst or a knowledge manager, what you care about is more than just, is it true? You care about where and who a statement comes from, what it means, who knows it, how they use it, what they use it to do, and many, many other things, right? Because all of that stuff is critical to the task of managing that knowledge, right? Of determining whether or not it's useful to your organization, whether your organization should rely on it or not, what your organization can do with that knowledge to further their own goals, et cetera, right? All of those are important questions, and particularly with this one, right? In this instance, what happens if someone who shouldn't learns how to use this knowledge to make an atomic bomb, right? This is, the equation that's at the heart of the physics that out of which you can make an atomic bomb, right? So one of the things that knowledge managers in the world are very concerned about, right? At the National Security Administration, for example, is how do you keep people who shouldn't know how to use this knowledge to make a bomb from doing so, right? That's a knowledge management kind of task. And it takes more than knowing, is it true? So what I want to argue in this video is that ways of knowing, this concept of ways of knowing, are one of the most important tools for understanding the relationship between knowledge and the people who know it, the people who use it, the people who manage it. We've got to know how people know things, and that's through this idea of ways of knowing, right? So to define ways of knowing, or a way of knowing in this particular case, from the dictionary of Clark, right? A way of knowing is the distinct social practices, processes, and methods through which a group creates, validates, communicates, and uses knowledge, right? So what are the methods that they use to make the knowledge in the first place, right? How did they determine whether that knowledge met their criteria, right, for being valuable or reliable knowledge? What were those criteria in the first place? How did they then communicate that knowledge? Who did they share it with? Who had it? Who didn't have it? And then how was that knowledge used in order to advance some particular task, some particular goal, some particular objective, right? And so you can begin to see as a knowledge manager why a way of knowing might be important to think about, because we care about all of these things. We care about how knowledge gets made. We care about how we decide whether knowledge is reliable or not. We care about who has access to knowledge and can use it to make decisions. And we care about how it gets used and whether it's being used properly to guide the decisions that the organization is making, right? So ways of knowing are central to the task of knowledge management. Well, what does that actually mean when we start to think about it in practice? So let's go back to our exhibit A equals MC squared, right? What is E equals MC squared? Well, it's a mathematical model of reality, of the natural world, of the behavior of natural objects, right? So physics as a way of knowing is particularly enamored of mathematical models of physical laws, right? So it isn't just enough for a physicist to know that mass and energy are convertible, although that's interesting, of course, right? They want to be able to describe what the relationship is in that conversion process using a mathematical equation or a mathematical model, right? So when we think about the way of knowing of physicists, they like to be able to use mathematical models and mathematical forms of reasoning to underpin the crucial bits of knowledge, the most important knowledge that they generate. And so those people who deliver new equations, right, new mathematical models of different parts of how the natural world work are the ones who are most valorized within the field of physics, right? So by contrast, let's take this statement. The median household savings for generation X is $64,000. This is a bit of economic knowledge. It's a bit of statistical knowledge, right? This is statistics. Median is a statistical word that means middle, right? It means half of the households in the country have a save in generation X have savings that are more than 64,000 and half have savings that are less than 64,000. It's very specific in that sense. Does not mean the same thing as mean or average, which are a different statistical term that means, right, when you divide the total by the total household savings for generation X by the number of households in generation X, that gives you the average or the mean, and that's a different number than the median household savings, right? This is statistics, right? It is a statement of fact. It was reported in a prominent economic news outlet, right? So it clearly has some status as knowledge about America and about American economics. It's not a mathematical law, right? It's not a mathematical model of in the form of an equation that describes some economic law, right? Rather, it's an observed economic fact. And of course, economics and many parts of the social sciences are highly statistical in their forms of analysis, their ways of knowing, right? They like statistics. They like to have knowledge that's not just, oh, look, that person in generation X has a savings of $64,000, but they like to be able to describe whole populations using statistical parameters like the median household savings, right? It gives them a feel for generation X. It allows them to compare generation X to the baby boomers, the generation before them. Do the baby boomers have a higher median household savings than generation X? What does that tell us? That this group has more savings median wise than this other group, right? These are, it's a different way of knowing about how the world works, right? So here's a third exhibit. American political culture tends to give precedence to quantifiable knowledge over other ways of knowing, right? This too is a bit of knowledge. It's a bit of knowledge that comes out of the field of science and technology studies at its political, the political end of the field, right? The end of the field that's concerned with the relationship between science and politics. It's an observable fact about American, something you would call American political culture, which is a concept in science and technology studies and in political science, right? And it is a way of characterizing how that political culture works, the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of ways of knowing that it gives privilege and preference to when making decisions. You can verify this knowledge, but you can't verify it through this particular fact, through statistics, right? You have to verify it through other kinds of data collected in other kinds of ways. It's more of a qualitative form of knowledge, right? So 3 examples of knowledge: E equals MC squared, the median household savings for Generation X is $64,000, and American political culture tends to give precedence to quantifiable knowledge over other ways of knowing. 3 facts, observable forms of knowledge about the world, but expressed in different forms of reasoning, different ways of knowing, right? So these knowledges reflect different ways of knowing. So what does it mean then to analyze ways of knowing? Well, it's useful to ask a set of questions. Within a particular way of knowing, who is an expert or a knower and who isn't, right? So each of these 3 disciplines, physics, economics, and science and technology studies, considers very different kinds of people experts, right? Economists, physicists, STSers, as they're often called, right? But all of them also share a characteristic that in order to become an expert in the field, you have to read a lot. You have to become knowledgeable about a wide range of theory. You have to become an expert practitioner of particular kinds of data collection methods, data analysis, right? It's also important to ask about a way of knowing what kinds of questions do the people who operate within a particular way of knowing ask about the world, right? Physics asks different questions than economics does. Different kinds of questions. Historians ask different kinds of questions than philosophers do, right? So each of these ways of knowing, right, ask different kinds of questions. What counts as a good answer to those questions? Sometimes the questions look remarkably similar, but you get very different answers to those questions across different ways of knowing. What kinds of evidence do people look for in searching for answers, right? Economists look for statistical evidence, right? Evidence of ways that properties play out across whole populations. They want to know things like the median household savings of a community. That matters, right? It's kind of evidence that matters to the questions that they ask, right? Whereas by contrast, historians generally don't look for statistical answers. They look for answers that are grounded in the life histories and experiences of particular individuals who lived in particular periods of time. And so they go looking for evidence in archives, right? In historical documents. What kind of methods do the particular people who are involved in a particular way of knowing use to assemble that evidence? How do they communicate their knowledge, right? Historians like to tell stories, right? History for them is narrative, right? It is a recognition that our understanding of the past is brought to us through the stories of the people who live in the past. Anthropologists write ethnographies, right? It's a form of knowledge, right? Generally takes the form of a book that attempts to present ethnography, writing graphy, ethnoculture, right? Present a culture through writing, a form of writing about that culture. It's different than a history, right? It's different than a biography. Think about a form of writing that historians often do, right? A biography is different than an ethnography. The writing of a single life versus the writing of a culture. Neither of those is a scientific journal article, right? Different form of communication, different kind of knowledge being presented. And then ultimately, who uses the knowledge? How do they use that knowledge and to what end? Another important characteristic of different ways of knowing. So are ways of knowing the same as knowledge cultures or knowledge systems? The short answer here is yes. These are other words that we will talk about in future videos, other ideas, other concepts. But they're very, very similar to the idea of a way of knowing. So for the moment, we're going to stick with this idea of ways of knowing and just recognize that there are many, many different kinds of ways of knowing in the world. And those ways of knowing shape the kinds of knowledge that gets created and used within the communities that share those ways of knowing. And we've talked about academic disciplines, and we'll come back to that idea down the road because academic disciplines are a critical part of ways of critical example of different ways of knowing that are very powerful. Modern professions are very much the same thing, whether it's medicine or nursing or journalism, criminal justice, right? We might as well think of those as disciplines for the purposes of thinking about ways of knowing because they too are encapsulate particular ways of knowing, particular ways of thinking about the world. And so I just want to highlight, right, this idea that we need to situate knowledge as a knowledge manager or a knowledge analyst. We can't just think about the statements, right? What we know. We have to think about the ways that what we know is known, right? What are these distinct cultures of knowing or communities of knowing, and what are the methods, the forms of evidence, the styles of reasoning that these different ways of knowing use in order to generate knowledge internally to themselves. And if you can grasp this idea and then learn, as I hope to help you do over the course of these videos, how to unpack these ways of knowing and really dig down and understand the forms of knowledge that are being generated within these different ways of knowing, then you have a really powerful tool for knowledge management and knowledge analysis. Thank you very much.